Welcome to the garden. Today we're going to be starting a brand new terrarium, and it's going to be a 2-in-1 tiny terrarium. I found this jar at a thrift store for 50 cents, and it's a beautiful little tiny jar, but the real reason I grabbed this jar is because of the lid. It has a hollow glass lid, so we can actually do another terrarium inside the lid. So we're going to have a tiny one here and a really tiny one in the top. So we're going to start with a little bit of charcoal. I'm just taking charcoal from our fire pit and I'm rinsing it off really well. I also want to break the pieces down so that it'll fit inside the jar. But by adding this charcoal, it'll help absorb impurities. Because of the micro porosity in the charcoal, it can absorb toxins and things, so it'll keep everything nice and clean. So we're just going to rinse this a few times until we get nice clear water. We've rinsed our charcoal so that the water's nice and clear now, so we can start picking out pieces about this size, and we're even going to put one in the cap. So I want a nice small piece. So I picked out some nice white rocks and some decent sized charcoal. So these are just about right to fit inside the jar. We're going to start with our little main terrarium, and we're going to do a layer of charcoal at the bottom. So I've gathered up a bunch of nice white rocks, just so that they have a bit of a contrast between the dark charcoal and the dark native soil. These are all about the same size. And we're going to do a good amount compared to our charcoal. We want a good layer here so that if there is any standing water in the base, it won't be in contact with the soil. Have a little bit of a buffer just so that the plants aren't saturated. I'm going to be taking samples of this moss here. I really like the way this grows. I like the color, the texture, everything about it's just perfect. So we're going to be using this for our terrarium. So if we uproot a piece of moss here, we can see there's quite a bit of native soil attached. So there's going to be bugs and probably some seeds and things in there as well. But because we're sealing our terrarium, any bugs and seeds that come up shouldn't really be a problem. But before we add this, we want to make sure it's nice and clean. So you can brush away anything you see that you don't like. So we'll break this up a little bit further. So I think this size is perfect for our lid. It's going to be a tight squeeze at first, but then there's plenty of room up in this cap. So we'll just do one final check and clean off our moss. Get rid of any dirt, anything that's kind of hanging off the edges can go. Just about like that looks good. So we're going to take our sample and really cluster it up. I really want to make sure that this is going to squeeze in, and then it'll unfurl as it gets settled. But as the initial setup, we really want a nice tight fit. Get rid of some extra soil. It's on its way up into the jar. But look at the result. That is beautiful. I'm going to push it a little bit further, but I don't want to go too far to where it actually gets dislodged. That is beautiful. So there we've got a nice set of moss. So to finish off the cap, I'm just going to stick in one little piece of charcoal right down in the base. So I'm going to add just a splash of water, just so that I know for sure we'll have enough moisture to keep that moss going. Then I'm going to put the plastic cap back on. And this was a little tricky to get off, actually. It's got a really tight snap. There. So there, we've got a really beautiful little micro terrarium with just moss. So to complement this really tiny one, we'll actually put some of the same moss in our larger terrarium. I've taken our moss down to about the size of the jar. Now this is not going to fit in the lid, so we're going to have to break this up a little bit further. I think I'm going to try splitting it in half so that we can do two little pieces. That way when we go and plant maybe some strawberries or some clover, we can actually nestle them right in the center where we've divided this. I'm going to pick a spot that's naturally weak in the moss. And I'm going to try and just split this in two. We might even be able to get this whole piece in by itself and then seal it back up like that. So let's give this a shot. This is basically like a ship in a bottle now. We're going to be using really small tools like this little piece of bamboo and just maneuver our moss around until we're satisfied. We can lose a little bit of soil to help it kind of squeeze through the jar. I want to try and get this piece down at the bottom right up against the glass so that there's room for the other piece. Got a little bit of work to do here. Looks really good. So now we can decide whether we want to add some more plants. I'm thinking maybe a strawberry or a clover would be really nice in here. And then we can clean everything up. You could use a spray bottle, but if you don't want to add extra water, a little Q-tip will just help swab up those dirt spots. So we'll just clean this up real quick. I've come to a part of the garden that's really covered with mosses and low ground covers. I would love to plant a little flower in the terrarium, but I think it's just a little too small for that. So we want to find an appropriate plant, and we've got quite a few choices. I think the terrarium is a little too small for dandelion, but something like a strawberry might actually work. Or a little piece of clover, if we can find one, would be lovely. But things are starting to bloom. So we've got a few options. We can choose something that's flowering and have a really beautiful setup, or we can choose something that hasn't flowered yet and hopefully watch it sprout. I want to try this little clover. Managed to find this little guy. And I broke him off from his main plant, but he's got a couple little roots there, so I think he'll be alright. It is really, that soil is really packed in there tight. So I probably should have done a little bit less soil. But I'm happy with how this moss is, so I'm not going to redo it quite yet. So I'll nestle that in. Make sure those roots are buried. I think that looks good. Now you can see we're already hanging out of the jar a little bit, so I am going to tuck these leaves back in. And it's not going to have much space to grow, but I think it'll be fine. There, that looks wonderful. So now we've got a little bit more interest with that clover. And I could probably squeeze another strawberry in there or something, but for now I think this is good. So we'll pop on our little cap. Just see how it looks. So this is an excellent little 2-in-1 terrarium. think it turned out great. So, because I'm so happy with it, I think we can water it in now. And this will be just about the final watering that we'll ever do. Got a great seal on this cap too. So we want to be extra careful not to overdo it. I'm using a spray bottle, and I'm going to start by just watering in our clover just a touch, and then we'll go around and just do a little squirt on the sides of the glass to settle that soil. It'll help clean everything up just a little bit. It'll add plenty of moisture so that when we seal this up, we don't really have to open it again to water it. I want to keep an eye on the bottom, make sure we don't have too much extra water pooling, but a little bit down at the bottom is okay. So now that everything's watered in, we'll just seal it up. Now this can sit in a bright location with very little to no direct sun. We don't want this heating up like an oven. We want to keep it nice and cool. But hopefully that moisture will kind of recycle itself. It'll stay nice and humid in here so that the moss survives, and maybe this clover will start to spread. I think this turned out really great. A nice little native terrarium. It's actually a 2-in-1 because we have a tiny terrarium in the lid as well. So really interesting little terrarium. So this is an excellent little Earth Day project. Really easy to do, just with materials you have from around the garden and a little thrift store jar. So I hope you give this a go. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.